It started like any other episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, laid back, engaging, and filled with the kind of free-flowing conversation that keeps millions of people tuning in. Joe, sitting across the table in his usual relaxed posture, cracked open a cold drink and adjusted his headphones. The neon sign behind him glowed softly, and the atmosphere was easygoing. Just two people about to dive into another long discussion. His guest for the day? A well-known liberal intellectual, someone with a reputation for sharp arguments and a tendency to dismantle conservative viewpoints with ease. Dressed in a crisp blazer, glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of his nose, he leaned forward slightly, exuding confidence. He had done his homework. He knew his talking points inside and out. He had debated on television panels before, sparred with political commentators, and always seemed to come out on top. Joe, as always, was calm, curious. He wasn't there to win debates. He just wanted a real conversation. But something about the way his guest sat, the way he smiled ever so slightly, suggested that he saw this as something else, a challenge, an opportunity. Today, he wasn't just here to talk. He was here to school Joe Rogan, and at first it seemed like he might just do it. The guest adjusts his blazer, clears his throat, and leans in slightly, signaling that he's about to take control of the conversation. His voice is smooth, practiced, carrying the confidence of someone who has been in this position before. He chooses his words carefully, laying out his argument like a lawyer making a case in court. "You see, Joe," he begins, his tone almost patronizing, "the problem with free speech in today's world is that it has been weaponized. What used to be a tool for open discourse has now become a shield for spreading dangerous misinformation, hate speech, and conspiracy theories." He pauses for effect, watching Joe's expression for any sign of disagreement, but Rogan remains unreadable, simply nodding along. Encouraged, the guest continues. He brings up examples, citing statistics from academic studies, research papers, and media reports, each one carefully selected to support his argument. He talks about how social media algorithms amplify divisive content, how disinformation spreads faster than truth, and how unchecked free speech can be exploited by bad actors to manipulate the masses. His words are well rehearsed, packed with references to scholars and institutions, and delivered with the kind of intellectual polish that makes people in newsrooms nod along approvingly. As he speaks, his confidence grows. He starts layering in more complex terminology, speaking about epistemic responsibility, narrative control, and linguistic frameworks of oppression. The sentences become longer, more intricate, and more authoritative. He isn't just arguing, he's performing. He assumes that Joe, a former stand-up comedian and martial arts enthusiast, won't have the depth of knowledge to challenge him on this level. The audience watching at home is split. Some are nodding, taking in the guest's words as undeniable truths. The way he delivers his points, the way he cites research and references prominent intellectuals, makes him sound convincing. But others start noticing something different. There's a certain smugness in the way he speaks, a quiet arrogance in the way he smirks between points, as if he's already declared himself the winner. At one point, he leans back slightly, a self-satisfied grin forming on his lips. And that's why the idea that free speech is some absolute right, immune to consequences, is not just outdated, it's dangerous. We live in a different world now, Joe. Words have power, and that power has to be regulated, or we risk losing control over reality itself. There it is, the final blow. He sits back in his chair, one hand resting on the table, waiting. He expects Joe to stumble, to fumble through a counterpoint, or to fall into the common trap of arguing in vague philosophical terms while he, the expert, sticks to cold, hard data. He's got this, or at least he thinks he does. Joe doesn't flinch. He doesn't shift in his chair, doesn't furrow his brow, doesn't interrupt. He just sits there, hands clasped in front of him, listening, really listening. His eyes stay locked on the guest, absorbing every word, every subtle inflection, every ounce of overconfidence laced in the argument. The silence that follows isn't awkward. It's intentional. It lingers just long enough for the guest to feel the weight of it. Then, Joe leans forward slightly, resting his elbow on the table. His tone is calm, almost casual, but there's an edge of curiosity behind it. "So let me get this straight," he says, his voice measured, deliberate. "You're saying free speech is dangerous because some people say dumb or harmful things?" The guest smirks, ready to double down. "Not just dumb, Joe. Harmful. Misinformation spreads like wildfire. Lies travel faster than truth. We have a responsibility to control that." Joe nods, tapping his fingers on the table. "Okay, but who decides what's misinformation?" The guest blinks, caught slightly off guard. "Well, obviously we have experts, fact-checkers." Joe cuts in gently, not aggressively, just enough to keep the conversation from slipping into rehearsed talking points. "Experts? You mean like the same ones who told us things that turned out to be false? The same ones who get things wrong all the time?" He shrugs. "I mean, look at the food industry. For decades, experts swore fat was bad for you, told people to eat more carbs, Turns out that advice was completely wrong and probably made a lot of people sick. Imagine if they had the power to silence anyone questioning them back then. The guest shifts in his seat. That's different. We're talking about speech, not diet. But it's the same principle, Joe interjects. Still relaxed, still keeping his tone neutral. Science changes. What we think is true today might not be true tomorrow. And if you give a small group of people the power to decide what can and can't be said, you're assuming they'll always get it right. But history shows us, over and over again, that they don't. The guest exhales sharply, clearly trying to keep control of the conversation. Joe, you're framing this like some dystopian nightmare where people are being thrown in jail for words. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying platforms, governments, institutions, they need to take some responsibility for the harm that speech can cause. Joe tilts his head slightly. You mean like how, not too long ago, people were banned from social media for saying COVID might have come from a lab? That was labeled misinformation. Now, even government agencies admit it's a possibility. So at what point do we admit that suppressing speech doesn't just control misinformation? It sometimes protects it. The guest opens his mouth to respond, but there's a brief hesitation. Just a second, just long enough for everyone watching to notice. He's searching for a way around the point, something airtight, something that will put him back in control, but it's not there. Joe lets the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. Wouldn't it be safer then to let people debate ideas in the open, instead of letting a handful of people decide what's true for everyone else? The guest shifts again, crossing his arms. That's a slippery slope argument, Joe. Nobody's saying we should ban debate. Joe smiles, finally leaning back in his chair. But you just did. You said free speech should be controlled. That means someone, somewhere decides what's allowed. And that's not free speech. The energy in the room shifts. The guest knows it. The audience knows it. The overconfidence from before is gone. He tries to push back, tries to reframe, but the seed of doubt has been planted. For the first time in the conversation, he doesn't look like the smartest guy in the room. The guest forces a chuckle, shaking his head as if Joe is being ridiculous. Look, Joe, I get what you're trying to do here, he says, offering a smirk that doesn't quite reach his eyes. You love the whole free speech absolutist angle. It's edgy, it's rebellious, it's very on brand for you. He waves a hand dismissively. But at some point, we have to draw a line. If someone is out there spreading dangerous lies, like, I don't know, that drinking bleach cures diseases, you wouldn't say they should have a platform, right? He leans back as if he's just played a trump card. The argument is a classic. Bring up the most extreme example. Make Joe seem unreasonable. He waits for Rogan to finally concede, to give him something that he can use to regain control. But Joe doesn't bite. He doesn't even blink. Dude, he says, shaking his head with a small laugh, if someone's dumb enough to drink bleach because they heard it on the internet, we've got bigger problems than free speech. The guest's smirk falters. Joe leans in again, voice steady. And you keep saying we need to draw a line, but who gets to draw it? Who decides what's too dangerous to be said out loud? You? The government? Tech companies? He shrugs. Because every time someone gets that kind of power, it always ends the same way. Their version of the truth is the only one allowed. The guest shifts in his chair. He knows he can't defend that point directly, so he tries another tactic, humor. All right, fine, he says, forcing a laugh. But you have to admit, Joe, this whole let people decide for themselves thing assumes people are, smart. Joe raises an eyebrow. You don't think they are? The guest hesitates, just for a second. He's walked into a trap and he knows it. Joe doesn't let up. See, that's the thing, man. You're not arguing against free speech. You're arguing against people. You're saying they can't handle information, so someone else needs to handle it for them. But who? And why should they get to decide? The guest stammers, trying to find a way to spin it, but the damage is done. The smug confidence from earlier is gone, replaced with nervous energy. He rubs the back of his neck, glances off camera, searching for something, anything to regain control of the conversation. Meanwhile, the chat is going insane. Holy shit, Joe just ended him. Bro really thought he could outsmart Rogan LMAO. This is embarrassing to watch. Dude was so cocky at first, and now he's melting. The guest tries to steer the conversation in a different direction. Look, I think we're getting lost in the weeds here, he says quickly. The real issue is how social media amplifies misinformation. Joe interrupts, still calm, still locked in. No, we're not lost at all. We're exactly where we need to be. The guest exhales, visibly frustrated. For the first time in the interview, it's obvious. He's out of his depth. The guest exhales sharply and leans back in his chair. His confident posture from earlier is gone. He's no longer the intellectual giant who walked in ready to educate Joe Rogan. Instead, he looks like a man who just realized he stepped into a debate he wasn't fully prepared for. There's a brief pause. just silence, the kind that makes the audience lean in closer, waiting for what comes next. Then, with a small, almost reluctant chuckle, the guest shakes his head. "All right," he mutters, rubbing his temple. "I'll be honest, Joe. I didn't expect you to push back this hard on this." Joe doesn't gloat. He doesn't smirk or act like he just won a fight. He just tilts his head slightly, watching, waiting. He's been here before. He knows this moment, the moment when a guest realizes they might have been wrong about something, even if they won't fully admit it. The guest sighs, gathering his thoughts. "I still think some regulation is necessary," he says, his voice quieter now, more measured. "But I get what you're saying. I get the concern about giving people too much control over the narrative." Joe nods, encouraging him to keep going. The guest runs a hand through his hair, thinking, "I guess, yeah, there have been times where so-called misinformation turned out to be true later. And yeah, people in power don't always make the right calls." He glances at Joe. "I still think we need safeguards, but maybe the way we're handling it now isn't the best approach." The chat explodes. Did he just admit he was wrong? Damn, never thought I'd see someone actually change their mind on JRE. Respect, at least he's owning up to it. Joe broke him LMAO. Joe stays relaxed, nodding again, but he doesn't press further. He doesn't rub it in or go for the knockout punch. That's not his style. He simply shrugs and says, "Yeah, man, it's a tricky thing. There's no easy answer. But the second we start deciding what people can't say, we're assuming the people in charge will always get it right. And history shows us they don't." The guest nods slowly. He doesn't argue this time. He just sits there, letting it sink in. For the audience, it's surreal. They're used to guests coming in, holding their ground, sticking to their talking points no matter what. But this is different. This is real. A moment where someone on live air has been challenged so thoroughly that they actually pause and think. And Joe? He just moves on to the next topic like it's nothing. The episode ends, but the conversation is far from over. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flood the internet. Twitter is on fire. Reddit threads dissect every moment. YouTube uploads with titles like "Joe Rogan destroys liberal guest" and "Watch this guy realize he's wrong in real time" rack up millions of views overnight. Memes explode across social media. Screenshots of the guest's stunned expression circulate with captions like, "When you come to JRE thinking you're the smartest guy in the room," and "That moment you realize you didn't do enough homework." His supporters are divided. Some scramble to defend him, saying he was caught off guard, that Rogan twisted the argument. Others aren't so sure. "I respect that he admitted he was wrong," one comment reads. "More people should do that." Meanwhile, Rogan's fans celebrate. "This is why I love JRE," someone tweets. "He doesn't argue to win. He argues to understand. And that's why he always comes out on top." As the dust settles, one thing is clear. This wasn't just another podcast episode. It was a rare moment of genuine intellectual honesty, something the internet doesn't see often. And whether people loved it or hated it, they couldn't stop talking about it. And that's why you never underestimate Joe Rogan.